The chandelier was sparkling. Balloons were floating above, when my son grabbed the microphone and spat venom. I wish I never had a father like him. Gasples cut through the air, forks stopped mid-stroke, and the music stopped. My heart pounded, but my eyes remained dry. I did not cry that night. I turned, left the hall, and returned to my lawyer. Before we get into why it turned out this way, if you believe that karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. The chandelier shimmered above me, scattering gold light across the crowded banquet hall. Balloons drifted lazily along the ceiling, and laughter rippled like music over the clinking of glasses. I had rented the place myself, paid for the cake, even convinced old friends and co-workers to come celebrate. 72 years of life. A milestone. I thought it would be a night of family of pride. My wife sat at the table near the front, head lowered, hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been quiet all week, but I thought it was nerves, not warning. Then Ethan, my only son, my blood stood up. He walked to the microphone with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its ears. His wife smiled from her seat, polished, elegant, the kind of woman whose diamond bracelets sparkled brighter than the chandelier. I watched Ethan scan the room, glass in one hand, the mic in the other. He cleared his throat. I wish I never had a father like him. Every dang gount. The words tore through me like a blade. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, but the silence that followed told me otherwise. Forks clattered against plates. Children froze mid-laugh. Even the DJ muted the music. Every face turned toward me. My smile collapsed. My throat locked. My heart pounded against my ribs like a prisoner begging release. He kept talking something about dignity, about embarrassment, but I barely heard. My own son had just erased me in front of 100 witnesses. The man I raised, the boy I carried through sleepless nights, now used my birthday as his stage to spit shame. I looked toward my wife. Her eyes stayed down, not meeting mine. She said nothing. No defense, no protest, only silence. The heat rose to my face, but no tears came. I would not give him that. I pressed my hands against the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened, then let them fall. My legs carried me out of that hall on their own, past faces that dared not stop me. My humiliation filled the room like smoke, and I left it there to choke them all. That night, I did not cry. That night, I began to think, long before the chandelier, before the banquet hall, there was a boy who called me hero. I still remember Ethan at 10 years old, running across the yard with a crooked grin, his shoelaces untied, yelling, "Dad, you're the best." Those words carried me through years of bills and burdens. They made every long shift at the bank worth it. I paid for his private school tuition when our neighbors said public school was good enough. I wanted him to have more than I ever did. I stayed late at work, reviewing loan files, sipping stale coffee, until my back ached. I told myself it was an investment in Ethan's future. When he turned 16, I handed him the keys to a used sedan I bought with savings meant for home repairs. He hugged me then, tears in his eyes, whispering, "I'll never forget this, Dad." But he did forget. College came, and with it more bills, tuition, books, rent. Ethan never saw the numbers, only the checks I wrote. When his credit card balance spun out of control, I sold a collection of rare coins my own father left me, just to clear his debt. I told myself it was love, but deep down, I feared I was teaching him something else, dependence without gratitude. Back then, I believed in him more than I believed in myself. I thought if I just kept giving, one day he'd turn around and see me not as a tired man in wrinkled shirts, but as the father who built his foundation brick by brick. Instead, every sacrifice seemed to vanish into a void, swallowed by his growing appetite for more. Now, standing in the echo of his cruel words, I wonder if that blind devotion was the seed of my humiliation. Maybe betrayal doesn't strike in a single moment. It creeps, slow and quiet, until it blooms into a sentence that severs you in half. That night at the party was the harvest of everything I had planted, and I had planted too much. Ethan's hunger for more began in college, and I fed it without question. He wanted freedom, so I co-signed his first credit card. I told him, "Use it wisely, son. Credit is like fire, it can keep you warm or burn your house down." He nodded, pretending to understand, but within months the bills came flooding in. Restaurants, gadgets, weekend trips I had never heard about. The numbers bled red across the statements. I should have let him face the collectors. Instead, I worked longer hours at the bank. I delayed repairs on the roof that leaked every spring. I sold off a few of my wife's old jewelry pieces quietly, so she wouldn't notice right away. When the balance still swallowed us, I cashed out part of my retirement fund. Ethan never saw the cost. He only saw the miracle, a clean slate delivered by his father. My wife tried to stop me once. "Mauricio, you're crippling us. Let him learn." Her voice shook with frustration, but I silenced her with a tired wave of my hand. "He's our son. He needs a chance." She sighed, folded her arms, and carried her silence into the years that followed. I mistook her quiet as agreement, but it was surrender. Ethan didn't change. With every bailout, he grew more entitled. His debts were no longer accidents, they were habits. Each time, I told myself it was the last rescue, the final sacrifice. But each time, I stepped in again. I thought I was protecting him from failure, but I was shielding him from reality. Looking back, I see how I built the very stage where he would one day destroy me. Every dollar I spent on his mistakes was another plank in that platform. Every sacrifice was another nail. And on my 72nd birthday, he climbed onto it, looked out over the crowd, and declared he wished I wasn't his father. That stage was mine. I built it, and he used it to bury me alive. Ethan's world shifted the day he met her, the woman who would become his wife. She was from money, the kind of family that wore silk without thinking about the cost, the kind that looked at a man like me and saw a pair of calloused hands, not the years of labor behind them. Ethan introduced her with pride, chest puffed out as if he had already been accepted into her world. I remember shaking her hand, her diamonds catching the light while her eyes slid past mine like I was a servant clearing dishes. At first, I believed it was just my insecurity speaking, but slowly, I saw Ethan change. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits home turned into excuses. I still kept giving. When he said they needed help with the down payment on an apartment, I didn't hesitate. I sold my wedding ring, 40 years of marriage melted into a check for him. I told myself it was worth it to see him secure. But when they moved in, Ethan boasted to her family about how hard he worked to afford it. My contribution vanished from his story, erased as if it had never existed. I stayed silent. Pride was not mine to have anymore, it belonged to Ethan, and I convinced myself that was enough. My wife watched me with weary eyes. She didn't argue. She just lowered her gaze, the same way she would years later at that banquet hall. The more Ethan climbed into that glittering world, the more he saw me as a weight tied to his ankles. When I called, he answered with impatience. When I offered advice, he laughed and called me old-fashioned. Yet I kept reaching into my pocket, offering what little I had left. By the time his wedding arrived, I was standing in the crowd like a guest, not a father. No speech, no toast, just a polite nod, while his in-laws whispered about my worn suit and scuffed shoes. I told myself it was enough to see him happy, but happiness built on lies is a house without a foundation, and I had been the one digging the ground out from under my own feet. The days leading to my birthday filled me with hope I hadn't felt in years. I told myself this celebration would be different. I bought a new suit, though the sleeves needed hemming. I ordered a cake tall enough to impress a crowd. I rented the banquet hall with money I should have saved. In my heart, I believed it would be the night Ethan and I stood side by side again, father and son. Maybe he would remember who had carried him through life. The invitations went out to old co-workers, neighbors, even distant relatives. I wrote Ethan's name at the top of the guest list in my own shaky handwriting. When the night came, I arrived early, checking the decorations twice, adjusting the silverware as though order could guarantee peace. Guests trickled in with hugs and warm words. I laughed politely, though my eyes searched for Ethan at every turn. When he finally arrived late, of course he swept into the hall like a celebrity. His wife clung to his arm, dressed in something that shimmered. Heads turned, whispers followed. My chest swelled with pride despite myself. He was still my son. I imagined him raising a glass to toast me, perhaps even thanking me for the sacrifices that had built his life. Instead, he asked for the microphone. I leaned back in my chair, heart brimming, waiting for words I thought I deserved. But what came out was poison. I wish I never had a father like him. The room gasped. The DJ cut the music, all eyes fixed on me. The cake I had ordered sat untouched, its candles flickering in silence. Ethan spoke more, words like knives about burden and embarrassment, but I heard nothing after the first strike. My world narrowed to the sound of his voice and the weight of 100 stares pressing against my back. I looked to my wife. She kept her gaze low, her lips pressed tight. No ally, no shield. That night, I realized the cruelest betrayals are not the loud ones, but the silences that follow. My birthday ended not with candles blown out, but with a father's dignity extinguished in front of all. Long before Ethan's words cut me open in that banquet hall, I had been bleeding quietly for years. At the bank, colleagues would pat me on the back and say, "Mauricio, you're past retirement age. Go rest. Enjoy yourself." I smiled, nodded, and filed another stack of loan applications. Retirement was not for men like me. My son needed tuition money, rent, help with car repairs. My life was a currency, and I kept spending it on him. The overtime hours stacked like bricks on my shoulders. I worked through birthdays, anniversaries, and Christmases, telling my wife we would celebrate later. Later never came. I ate dinners from vending machines, washed down with burnt coffee. My hands trembled from fatigue. But I signed papers steady enough to pass for strong. Every paycheck I slid across the counter to Ethan felt like a victory. He never saw the ledger I kept hidden in my desk drawer, the one where my savings dwindled with every month. He never noticed the dark circles under my eyes when I showed up at his college with a bag of groceries. He just took the keys, the cash, the comfort, and smiled like it was owed to him. I told myself this was fatherhood. That sacrifice was proof of love. My coworkers thought I was loyal to the bank, but I was only loyal to my son's future. Each hour I sold was another brick in a house I thought we'd share. But the truth was, I was building him a castle while I slept in the ruins. At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, calculating numbers in my head. I told myself it was temporary, that once Ethan graduated, once he stood on his own, I would finally rest. But the finish line kept moving, just out of reach, because Ethan never stopped needing, and I never stopped giving. Those hours I sold, they were pieces of my life I would never get back. And when he said he wished I was never his father, I realized he had never seen them as gifts at all. There are photographs missing from our family albums, moments that should have been mine but were spent beneath the harsh light of the bank. My wife used to leave empty frames on the mantel, saying, "We'll fill them when you're free." They are still empty. I missed Ethan's first school play because I stayed late processing mortgages. I promised I would be at his soccer match, but a client crisis kept me at my desk until nightfall. My wife called me, whispering into the phone, "He keeps looking for you in the stands." I told her to give him a hug for me. She hung up quietly, disappointment heavy in her silence. Vacations were another lie I told. Each summer, Ethan asked if we could go somewhere, anywhere. The beach, the mountains, even just camping. I said, "Next year, son." Once I'm caught up. Next year turned into a decade. Instead of packing bags, I packed his lunch money. Instead of road trips, I signed checks for his classes. Even our anniversaries, 40 years of marriage, were marked not with candlelight dinners, but with me stumbling home late, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. My wife smiled politely, but the flame in her eyes dimmed with each passing year. I convinced myself she understood, that she supported my sacrifices. But love grows brittle when it is starved. The cruelest truth is that Ethan did not remember the gifts I gave, only the absences. In his eyes, I was the father who wasn't there at the game, the father who didn't clap at the play, the father who broke promises of vacations. He remembered the shadows, not the light. I traded memories for money, believing the money would one day buy me respect. Instead, it bought me silence at the banquet hall, where not one guest stood for me, not even my wife. I had given up so much of life for them, only to discover that absence leaves a louder mark than sacrifice ever could. I remember the first time Ethan called me old man. Not with affection, not with a laugh, but with disdain. He was in college, home for the weekend, and we were standing in the driveway. I offered him advice about budgeting, about being careful with loans. He rolled his eyes and said, "Relax, old man. You don't get how things work anymore." The word stung, though I forced a chuckle. Old man. I told myself it was just youthful arrogance, that he didn't mean it. But something shifted that day. For the first time, I saw a crack in the boy I raised, a glimpse of the man he was becoming. After that, the dismissals came more often. If I suggested he bring a coat, he scoffed. If I mentioned saving money, he smirked and said, "Dad, that's outdated thinking." At dinners, he mocked the way I folded napkins or the way I still carried cash in my wallet. His friends laughed, and he basked in their approval. My wife would lower her eyes, unwilling to correct him, unwilling to defend me. Her silence became the chorus to his insults. Each cut was small, but together they carved away pieces of me. I swallowed my pride, convincing myself that ridicule was better than distance. I thought if I absorbed his disrespect, I could still keep him close. But closeness without respect is nothing more than captivity. It wasn't just words. When I asked for help around the house, fixing the fence, moving boxes, he brushed me off. Hire someone, Dad. You've got the money. As if my labor, my age, my hands meant nothing. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees now looked at me like I was a relic. That was the beginning of the slow death. Not a dagger to the heart, but 1,000 paper cuts that bled me dry. I told myself I was strong enough to endure it. I told myself he would outgrow it. But he never did. He only sharpened his words until they were ready for the day he would cut me down in front of everyone. It wasn't only credit cards and tuition. Ethan had bigger dreams, bigger risks, and I was always the safety net stretched beneath him. I remember when he tried to start a business with 2 college friends. Some kind of tech service, half-baked and poorly planned. They poured money into it, and within months, the creditors were circling. Ethan came to me with panic in his eyes, the same eyes that once begged me to fix his broken toys. Only this time, the stakes were thousands of dollars. I should have let him face the consequences, but instead, I wrote checks, quiet ones. I called the creditors myself, negotiating payments, settling debts. I sold off the last of my father's coin collection pieces I had guarded for decades. In exchange, Ethan's name stayed clean. His reputation remained intact. He told his friends he handled it. He even bragged to his in-laws about his quick thinking. My sacrifice became his lie. That wasn't the last time. There was the car accident he caused, when he called me instead of the insurance company. I wired money before the police reports could stain his record. There was the eviction notice from his apartment, when I paid off the landlord to keep him housed. Each time, I told myself, this is the last rescue. And each time, I stepped forward again. My wife asked me once, Mauricio, when will he learn? I answered softly, when he's ready. But the truth was, I wasn't waiting for him to learn. I was afraid of watching him fall. I had spent so much of my life cushioning his landings that I didn't know how to let him crash. The irony is cruel. I thought I was protecting him from shame, yet in the end, he used shame as the weapon against me. He stood in that hall, reputation spotless, life polished, and he built it all on the rescues I provided. My rescues became his wings, and he used them to fly above me, looking down with nothing but scorn. It was not the banquet hall that first taught me humiliation. It was the whispers I overheard years before, drifting from Ethan's lips into the ears of his wealthy in-laws. I had come by his apartment one evening to drop off some documents he needed signed. I arrived earlier than expected, and the front door was ajar. Laughter floated out, glasses clinked, and I heard my son's voice louder than the rest. My dad? He's just a clerk, still pushing papers at the bank. Can you believe he never moved up? 70 years old and nothing to show for it. The room erupted in polite laughter, the kind that stings more than open mockery. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand gripping the envelope so tightly it crumpled. Clerk. Just a clerk. The same job that had fed him, clothed him, paid for his schools, his debts, his apartment. To them, I was a joke. To Ethan, I was dead weight he carried like a shameful secret. I didn't step inside. I left the papers in his mailbox and walked back to my car. My chest ached as though someone had pressed a stone against it. I sat there, staring at the steering wheel, while the laughter echoed from above. That night, I drove home slower than usual, headlights painting the road in a blur of grief. I never told my wife. She would have lowered her gaze, just as she always did. Silence had become her refuge, but silence was a coffin for me. I carried those words alone, letting them gnaw at me in the dark. And yet I still gave. I still answered his calls. I still signed checks. Even as I knew how he spoke of me when my back was turned, I kept showing up. I told myself that love demanded endurance, that maybe he mocked me to impress them, but deep down he knew the truth. But the truth is, he didn't. The whispers were not slips of pride, they were rehearsals for the day he would shame me in front of everyone. That night in the apartment was only the first draft of my public execution. If betrayal has a sound, sometimes it is silence. My wife's silence weighed heavier than Ethan's insults. For decades, she stood beside me in name, but not in voice. When Ethan mocked me at the dinner table, she lowered her gaze to her plate. When he dismissed my advice with a smirk, she busied herself, refilling glasses. And on the night of my birthday, when he declared his wish to never have a father like me, she pressed her lips together and said nothing. I used to excuse her quiet as peacekeeping. She doesn't want conflict, I told myself. But over time, her silence became agreement. Each unspoken word was a nail in the coffin of our marriage. She was the witness to my sacrifices. She saw the overtime hours, the coins I sold, the ring I pawned. She watched me stumble through the door with aching bones, carrying groceries for a son who never thanked me. Yet when the world turned against me, she folded her hands and chose stillness. There were moments I searched her eyes for rescue. When Ethan scoffed at my old suit at his wedding, I looked to her. She looked away. When he called me just a clerk, I hoped she would correct him. She didn't. When he erased me at the banquet hall, her silence was louder than his words. It is a strange kind of loneliness to sleep beside someone who has already left you in spirit. I carried Ethan on my shoulders, but she could have carried me with one sentence, one defense. Instead, she lowered her gaze, and I drowned alone. I no longer knew if she stayed out of loyalty, fear, or convenience. All I knew was that I had no ally in my own home. Betrayal wears many faces. Ethan's was loud and cruel. Hers was quiet, patient, and suffocating. That night at the hall, as I walked out past her bowed head, I realized I was not just a father abandoned by his son. I was a husband abandoned by his wife's silence. And that silence, perhaps, was the deeper wound. Late one night, long before the birthday humiliation, I sat alone at my desk with the old will open before me. The house was quiet, my wife asleep, Ethan long gone to his new life. I held the pen in my hand but did not move. My name looked foreign on the paper, as though it belonged to a man who had given everything away and still held nothing. The will was simple. Everything, house, savings, possessions, was written to go to Ethan. Years earlier, when I first drafted it, I felt proud. It was proof that every sacrifice would one day secure his future. But as I stared at it that night, the pride curdled into shame. I thought of the coins I had sold, the hours I had worked, the ring I had pawned, all to build a foundation for a son who now mocked me. My ledger of life was filled with red ink, not from money, but from dignity. I flipped open a notebook where I had kept records, tuition payments, car repairs, loan balances I had paid down in his name. Line after line, the numbers stretched across the pages like gravestones. Each figure represented a piece of me I had buried for his sake. I traced them with my finger and whispered, "This was my life." That night, something shifted. I no longer saw sacrifice as love. I saw it as a debt Ethan never intended to repay. The will in front of me felt like the final insult, a document that would let him inherit not just what I had saved, but the right to forget everything I had endured. I closed the folder, my hand trembling not from age but from clarity. Perhaps the time had come to rewrite more than a document. Perhaps the time had come to rewrite the story of my life. Because what good is a father's legacy if it only teaches his son how to despise him? That night, I didn't cry. That night, I began to calculate a new kind of math, one that would balance the ledger of regret with something colder, sharper, and final. The first time I walked into Mr. Callahan's office, the air smelled of old books and leather. Certificates lined the walls, each one a quiet declaration of power. I stood in the doorway, hat in my hand like a schoolboy, though I was 72. I had come not as a banker, not as a father, but as a man stripped bare by betrayal. Mr. Callahan had known me for years. We crossed paths when he refinanced loans for my clients. He rose from behind his desk, shook my hand, and said, "Mauricio, what brings you here?" His tone was kind, but his eyes were sharp. Lawyers don't waste time on sentiment. I sat down, the leather chair swallowing me whole. For a moment, I didn't know where to begin. Then the words spilled out. The birthday party, Ethan's public humiliation, the years of sacrifices buried under his arrogance. Callahan listened without interruption, his pen scratching notes as if he were etching my pain into permanence. When I finished, he leaned back. "You've given him everything," he said, "but what have you kept for yourself?" The question hit harder than Ethan's insult. I realized I had no answer. I had nothing. My life's work, my savings, even my dignity, I had poured it all into my son's hands, only for him to drop it into the gutter. Callahan opened a folder and slid it across the desk. "You have more power than you think. A will can be rewritten. Assets can be protected. Accounts can be frozen. If you act now, Ethan will have nothing he assumes is already his." I looked at the folder, my reflection warped on its glossy cover. For decades, I had believed my role as a father was to give until there was nothing left. But sitting there, I realized there was one final gift I could offer Ethan, the gift of consequences. That day, I stepped through more than a lawyer's door. I stepped into the possibility of justice, quiet and cold, waiting to be written in ink. After that meeting, I began digging through the dust of my past like an archaeologist of my own suffering. My study became a vault of evidence, shoeboxes of receipts, stacks of bank statements, faded letters from creditors. Every scrap of paper told a story. One Ethan had long forgotten, but I could never erase. I pulled out the tuition checks, copies of every one I had written. 4 years of signatures, each line my lifeblood poured into his future. I laid them on the desk in order, the ink growing shakier with each passing year. Then came the receipts for his first car, the repair bills, the gas cards. I even found the pawn slip for my wedding ring, folded and worn, a testament to the price of his apartment's down payment. I arranged it all carefully, like a prosecutor preparing exhibits. If Ethan wanted to erase my name, I would carve it into stone with proof. He could deny gratitude, but he could not deny numbers. Paper does not forget. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. Every bailout, every transfer, every quiet rescue, I had documented it, though at the time I didn't know why. Perhaps some part of me had always feared this day, when love would turn to betrayal and memory would fail. Now those records became my weapons. Not bullets, not blades, just the quiet, undeniable weight of truth. At night, I sat at my desk, surrounded by piles of evidence, the lamplight casting shadows that stretched like ghosts. I thought of Ethan's words, "I wish I never had a father like him," and I whispered back to the papers, "Then let him see what a father's sacrifice really costs." When the boxes were full, I sealed them with tape and marked them with dates. They were no longer just records of money. They were my testimony, my archive of truth. And one day soon, they would speak louder than Ethan ever could. It was during this search through records that I found something darker. At first, it was just a hunch, a small discrepancy in a bank statement. My pension withdrawals didn't line up. I traced the numbers backward, line by line, until I discovered transfers I had never authorized. Money siphoned from a joint account, moved quietly into Ethan's hands. The dates told their own story. While I was still paying his debts, still covering his bills, he had been dipping into my savings like it was his right. Hundreds at first, then thousands. The numbers stacked until I felt sick. It wasn't desperation that drove him, it was entitlement. He had been stealing from me while I was still breaking my back to give him everything. I confronted the evidence in silence, gripping the papers until they crumpled. My chest tightened, rage threatening to break through. But I didn't shout. I didn't call him. Anger was what he expected. Instead, I let the fury cool into something sharper, something colder. A father's love had blinded me for too long. Now I would see with clear eyes. The betrayal burned deeper because it was hidden. Ethan hadn't asked. He hadn't begged. He had simply taken, assuming I would never notice or worse, that I would forgive it if I did. He thought my sacrifices were endless, my dignity disposable. I locked the papers in a drawer, the key heavy in my palm. This was no longer about humiliation. This was theft, written in numbers and ink. And theft could be answered with law, not tears. That night, I sat in the dark and realized Ethan had not only shamed me, he had robbed me. But in robbing me, he had given me something new. He had given me the weapon I needed. Not vengeance in shadows, but justice in daylight. The discovery of stolen funds was a wound, but the next revelation cut even deeper. One afternoon, while reviewing insurance papers, I noticed my name missing from a family policy I had carried for decades. Confused, I called the office, thinking it was a clerical error. The woman on the line placed me on hold, then returned with a chilling answer. The policyholder, Ethan, had requested my removal months ago. I sat there in silence, the phone pressed against my ear as her words echoed. Removed, discarded as though I were already gone. I had been paying into that policy since Ethan was a boy, making sure if anything happened, he would never be left unprotected. Now, with a single signature, he had erased me from my own safeguard. I asked for copies. When the envelope arrived days later, I opened it with trembling hands. His signature was there, bold and clean, declaring me unnecessary. To him, I wasn't just a burden in life, I was expendable even in death. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers. My wife glanced at them once, then lowered her eyes as she always did. No words, no protest, only silence. I folded the documents slowly and placed them in the growing archive of betrayal. For years, I believed sacrifice would secure loyalty, that if I gave enough, Ethan would honor me. But this was no longer neglect, no longer arrogance. It was deliberate. He was cutting me out piece by piece, first from his respect, then from his reputation, now from his very plans for the future. I felt something inside me harden. The man who had worked himself raw for his son no longer existed. In his place sat someone colder, quieter, more dangerous. Ethan had not only erased me from a policy, he had erased the illusion that love alone could hold us together. And in that erasure, he freed me to act. When I carried the box of documents back into Callahan's office, his eyes sharpened. He sifted through the receipts, bank statements, and insurance papers with the precision of a surgeon. With every page he turned, the silence in the room thickened. Finally, he set the stack down and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. "Mauricio," he said, tapping the folder, "you've been treated unjustly, but you're not powerless. Legally, Ethan has no claim to what you choose to protect. These accounts, these assets, they can be secured. And this..." He held up the papers showing Ethan's unauthorized transfers. "This isn't just betrayal. This is theft. If you want, we can take it to court." The word theft rang in my ears. I had thought of it as betrayal, as disrespect, but theft gave it weight. Theft had consequences. Theft meant the law could stand beside me where my family had not. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me. For the first time, I wasn't picturing Ethan as my son. I was picturing him as a man who had stolen from me, lied about me, and humiliated me. And a man like that deserved to face the truth. Callahan slid a fresh folder across the desk. "We'll rewrite your will, redirect your assets, establish protections he can't touch. If he tries to claim them, he'll find the doors locked. And if he pushes further, this evidence will bury him in court." I rested my hand on the folder, feeling the cool gloss beneath my fingertips. It was heavier than paper, it was armor. For decades, I had given Ethan everything, believing sacrifice was my duty. But sitting there, I realized I had one duty left: to protect myself. I nodded once. Do it. That single word ended a lifetime of submission. From that moment, the law was no longer just an institution I had worked for. It was the blade I would wield. Quiet, legal, irrefutable. The old will sat in my safe like a relic of a man who no longer existed. In it, every dollar, every possession, every scrap of my life was written in Ethan's name. It was my final promise to him, drafted in the days when I still believed gratitude would outlive me. Now, it mocked me. Callahan laid the new draft before me, the paper crisp and clean. "This document," he said, "is airtight. He cannot contest it without exposing himself." I read every line slowly, letting the words wash over me. My estate was no longer Ethan's inheritance. Instead, I redirected the assets, some to charity, some to distant relatives who had never asked for anything, some locked in trusts that Ethan would never touch. As my pen hovered above the signature line, my hand trembled not from doubt, but from release. I thought of the decades I had spent trading my health for his comfort. I thought of the wedding ring I pawned, the coins I sold, the hours I lost. All of it had been fuel for a fire that only burned me in the end. With this stroke of ink, I was no longer feeding that fire. I signed. The sound of the pen scratching across the page felt louder than Ethan's birthday speech, louder than his insults, louder than my wife's silence. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. Callahan gathered the papers, slid them into a folder, and sealed it. "It's done," he said firmly. I sat back in the chair, my chest rising and falling with a weight I hadn't realized I carried. The old will remained in my safe, untouched, a decoy for the son who still believed he had already won. The real future was here, in Callahan's folder, carried out of the office like a hidden blade. That night, as I placed the decoy back into the safe, I whispered into the silence, "Not everything is yours, Ethan. Not anymore." Weeks later, I returned to Callahan's office one last time. The city outside buzzed with its usual noise, but inside, everything felt hushed, deliberate. The folder with my new will lay on the desk, sealed and stamped. Callahan pushed it toward me. "It's official," he said. "Your son has no claim." I traced the edge of the folder with my fingers. It felt heavier than any ledger I had balanced at the bank, heavier than the envelopes of cash I had handed Ethan over the years. This wasn't money. This was power, the kind I had always surrendered, now reclaimed. Callahan studied me. Do you want him to know? I shook my head. Number, let him believe. Let him think the world is still his. The silence will hurt more than the news. For years, Ethan had built his arrogance on the assumption that I would always give, always bow, always erase myself for his sake. With this sealed folder, I had broken that chain. He would not see it coming. He would not understand it until the moment came, and by then, it would be too late. I slipped the folder into my briefcase, the latch clicking shut like the closing of a cell door. Not for me, for him. Every step I took leaving that office felt lighter, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath me. At home, I placed the briefcase in the study and locked the door. My wife asked where I had been. I told her only, tying up loose ends. She looked at me, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but said nothing. As always, her silence filled the room. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the dark, the briefcase at my feet. For the first time in decades, I wasn't calculating Ethan's bills or planning his rescues. I was planning his reckoning, not through anger, not through fists, through ink, through law, through truth. I lifted the glass and whispered into the shadows. It's done. The old will remained in my safe, tucked neatly in its folder, a relic of blind devotion. It promised Ethan everything: my house, my savings, even the watch my father gave me when I first started at the bank. For years, I believed leaving it all to him was the purest act of love a father could give. Now, it was bait. I placed it back into the safe deliberately, knowing one day Ethan might go searching. He was arrogant enough to pry, careless enough to believe what he saw. When he found that old will, he would see confirmation of the story he told himself, that no matter what he did, no matter how cruel his words, I would still leave him everything. It would keep him blind, complacent. Meanwhile, the true will rested under Callahan's lock and key, ironclad and untouchable. In it, Ethan's name was absent. Every asset was secured elsewhere: trusts, charities, relatives who had never asked me for a dime. Not a single cent, not a single brick of my house would fall into his hands. I felt no guilt. I had already paid Ethan in full with decades of sacrifice. The debt was settled. This was not theft, it was balance. At night, I sometimes imagined the look on his face when the truth surfaced. He would stand in a lawyer's office expecting to hear his inheritance read aloud like a coronation. Instead, he would hear his exclusion line by line, clause by clause, until nothing remained. And in that silence, he would finally understand what it meant to lose. The old will was a mask. The new will was a blade. One would keep him dreaming, the other would cut him awake. For the first time in years, I slept soundly. Not because I trusted Ethan, but because I had finally stopped trusting him at all. Ethan had built his reputation on polish. To his in-laws, he was the picture of success. A young man with ambition, a charming smile, and a future paved in gold. They never saw the unpaid bills, the debt collectors, the rescues I staged in silence. They believed the image he sold them because I never spoke. I carried his shame for him, like a mule burdened with secrets. But mules grow tired. One evening, I mailed out a package. Inside were photocopies of his debts, the bank transfers I had covered, even the pawn slip for my wedding ring. I did not send them anonymously. I signed my name at the bottom of a simple note. This is the truth of Ethan Hayes. Draw your own conclusions. I sent them to his in-laws, his friends, even his old professors, who once praised his promise. I wasn't cruel in my words. I didn't embellish. I simply laid the truth bare, stripped of excuses. The fallout came quietly at first. A canceled dinner invitation, a colleague who stopped returning his calls, then louder, whispers in social gatherings, sidelong glances, polite but distant smiles. His wife's parents began to ask questions he could not answer. The shine on his reputation dulled like tarnished silver. I heard of it not from Ethan, but from the silence that followed. Weeks passed without his calls, without his demands. My wife looked at me once across the table, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "Did you do something?" she asked. I simply sipped my tea. For the first time in my life, I did not explain myself. What Ethan never understood was that lies rot from the inside out. I had only cracked the shell so others could see what was already festering. He had built his castle on my sacrifices, but once the foundation was exposed, the walls began to crumble on their own. I did not gloat, I did not boast. I simply watched as silence turned into shame, and for once, it was not mine. The cracks in Ethan's perfect image spread faster than even I expected. His in-laws, who once paraded him through their circles like a prize stallion, began to pull back. Invitations stopped arriving. His father-in-law, a man who valued reputation above all else, grew colder each time they met. Whispers followed Ethan into every room, whispers born from the truth I had released into the world. His allies fell away one by one. The professors, who once praised his promise, no longer recommended him for projects. Friends who had enjoyed his charm discovered the weight of his debts, and chose distance instead of loyalty. Even his colleagues at work began to keep him at arm's length, polite but wary, as though he carried contagion. At home, his wife's smile thinned. I heard from neighbors that arguments echoed through their apartment walls, raised voices, slammed doors. She had married a man who promised wealth and security. Now she saw cracks in his story, cracks she could not plaster over with diamonds. And though she never spoke to me, I knew the truth. She was reconsidering her place at his side. I watched all this unfold without lifting a finger. I had already played my part by setting the truth free. The rest was inevitable. Ethan's world had been built on borrowed pride, and borrowed pride collapses when the lender comes to collect. I did not celebrate his abandonment. There was no joy in watching my son unravel, but there was justice. For once, the silence that filled the rooms was not mine, it was his. The man who had humiliated me in front of 100 faces was now humiliated in front of the world he tried so desperately to impress. And the cruelest part? He didn't even know the worst of it yet. He still believed the old will was his salvation. He still believed he could outlive his shame with my inheritance. What he didn't know was that his inheritance had already slipped through his fingers, signed away with a pen he would never hold. The first time Ethan called me in panic, it was about money. Not unusual. His voice carried that same edge of entitlement, though laced now with desperation. "Dad, something's wrong with my accounts. The card won't go through." I kept my tone flat. "Check again." But I already knew. Callahan had filed the papers the week before. The accounts Ethan had been quietly siphoning from were frozen, locked tight under legal authority. He had treated my savings like his personal fountain. Now, the fountain had run dry. In the days that followed, his calls multiplied. Angry voicemails, texts full of accusations. "How could you do this? I need that money. You've ruined everything." Each message revealed the truth he had never admitted. He depended on me still, even after declaring before the world that he wished I wasn't his father. I listened to them once, then deleted them. I no longer felt the urge to rescue. Each cry for help was a reminder of every hour I had sold at the bank, every coin I had pawned, every piece of myself I had traded for his comfort. Enough. The account was closed, in every sense of the word. Ethan's rage grew. Neighbors whispered about his shouting matches, his wife's family pulling further away. At last, he came pounding on my door, demanding answers. I opened it just enough to look at him. His eyes were wild, his jaw tight with fury. "You froze my accounts," he spat. I said nothing. I simply handed him Callahan's card through the crack of the door. "Talk to my lawyer." Then I shut it. The sound of his fists against the wood echoed through the house, but I did not flinch. I sat in my chair, hands folded, and let the storm rage outside. For the first time it was Ethan standing in the cold, powerless, and me silent, steady, untouchable. It was a modest gathering at the community hall. Neighbors, old co-workers, even a few distant relatives, people who had known me as the quiet banker, the man who stayed late at his desk, who missed birthdays and vacations because he was always working. They never knew why. That night, I told them. I stood at the podium, my hands steady on the wood. "For years," I began, "people asked me why I never retired, why I sacrificed so much. The truth is, I gave everything to my son." A murmur spread through the crowd. I opened the box I had carried in, the same archive of truth I had built piece by piece. I laid out photocopies of tuition checks, credit card payments, even the pawn slip for my wedding ring. I worked overtime shifts to cover his tuition. I sold family heirlooms to erase his debts. I pawned the ring my wife placed on my finger 40 years ago, just so he could have a home. I gave until there was nothing left to give. To there's now as this Spiri. The room was silent, every eye fixed on me. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, jaws tight with anger on my behalf. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't need volume, it needs presence. And how did he thank me? I continued. My throat tightened, but I held steady. By standing in front of 100 people on my birthday and declaring he wished I had never been his father. Gasps broke through the silence. I let them linger. I closed the folder, slid it back into the box, and stepped away from the podium. I am not telling you this for pity, I said. I am telling you because silence protects the wrong people. No more silence. Applause rose hesitant at first, then stronger, until it filled the hall. For once, the weight I carried did not bury me. It lifted. The truth was mine again, and it no longer whispered in the dark. It spoke in daylight, in the voices of those who now saw me clearly. Ethan came to me again, his pride thinner than paper. This time, he didn't storm in with rage. He arrived late at night, eyes hollow, suit wrinkled, the shine of his arrogance stripped away. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him, not the boy I raised, nor the man who mocked me, but something smaller, weaker, desperate. He stood in the doorway, shoulders slumped. "Dad, we need to talk," he said. His voice cracked on the word dad, as if it were foreign to him now. I let him in. He paced the living room, his hands running through his hair. "They're all turning on me, her parents, my colleagues. Even my wife is distant. I just need a little help, a bridge until things turn around. You've always been there for me, please." I watched him carefully, studying the face I had once carried on my shoulders. For decades, I had answered these pleas without hesitation. But tonight, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single business card Callahan's. I held it out to him. "What's this?" he asked, confused. "My lawyer," I said simply. He blinked at me, waiting for more, waiting for the rescue that never came. But I offered nothing else. No money, no excuses, no comfort, just the card. "Dad, I'm asking you." His voice rose, desperation spilling into anger. "You can't just sit there. You're my father." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "And I've already done my part." The silence stretched between us, heavier than any shout. At last, he snatched the card from my hand and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I sat back in my chair, the echoes fading into quiet. For the first time in my life, I had not given him what he demanded. I had given him something far colder. Accountability, and that, more than any check I had ever written, was the real gift he had earned. When Ethan realized he could not sway me, he turned to the one person he thought might still bend my wife. I overheard their voices one afternoon, drifting down the hall like a storm brewing behind closed doors. "Mom, you have to talk to him," Ethan pleaded. "He's lost it. Freezing accounts, lawyers, this madness. You know he can't really mean it. He's just angry. Tell him to stop." For years, she had been his silent shield, her lowered eyes, a quiet permission for his arrogance. I expected to hear that same silence now. But when I stepped into the doorway, I saw something different. She stood with her back straight, her hands trembling but clenched. Her eyes, usually cast downward, met his squarely. "No, Ethan," she said softly but firmly. "It's not madness. It's what you made of him." Ethan froze, disbelief flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice did not break. "I watched him sell his father's coins to pay your debts. I watched him pawn his wedding ring so you could have a home. I watched him work himself sick while you mocked him, and I said nothing. That was my failure. But don't you dare stand here and call him mad for finally protecting himself." Her words struck the air like a gavel. Ethan stammered, his confidence unraveling. You're supposed to be on my side." She shook her head slowly. "I was. Too long. But not anymore. Things is 79. For the first time in years, she had broken her silence. And in that moment, Ethan stood truly alone, not just without allies in his polished world, but without the quiet shield he had always counted on at home. He left the house that day without another word, the door closing like a verdict. My wife sank into a chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Mauricio." I placed my hand over hers. For once, she had spoken not as his defender, but as mine. The call came from Callahan. "He's here," the lawyer said. "He's demanding answers." I felt no surprise. Ethan had been circling closer for weeks, his desperation sharpening into fury. Now the day had come. I walked into the office to find Ethan already standing there, pacing like a caged animal. He turned when he saw me, his face a mask of outrage. "Tell me this isn't true," he barked. Tell me you didn't rewrite the will. Callahan's calm voice cut through the tension. Mr. Hayes, your father has every legal right to distribute his estate as he chooses. Ethan slammed his fist on the desk. Everything I've done for this family, for you, and this is how you repay me. His words dripped with indignation, but beneath it, I heard fear. He had built his entire future on an inheritance he thought guaranteed. I stepped forward, my cane tapping lightly against the floor. My voice was steady, cold. Everything you've done, Ethan, you've taken. And taken. And taken. I paid your debts. I sold my ring. I worked myself sick so you could stand tall. And in return, you stood at my birthday party and told the world you wished I wasn't your father. He flinched, but I did not soften. I reached into my coat and placed a single envelope on the table. This is the new will. It names you nowhere. Every cent is gone from your grasp. Every door you thought was open is closed. Ethan's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, silence was his weapon turned against him. I leaned closer, my eyes locked on his. This isn't revenge, Ethan. This is a receipt, payment in full for every sacrifice you've forgotten. Callahan gathered the papers, his voice final. The matter is settled. I turned and walked out, my cane tapping like a gavel striking judgment. Behind me, Ethan's world collapsed in silence, just as mine had on that birthday night. The silence after the showdown was different, not heavy with humiliation, but light, clean, like air after a storm. Ethan's face, drained of arrogance, haunted me for days, but not in sorrow. In truth, it was the first time I had seen him stripped bare of entitlement, and for once I did not feel pity. I felt peace. He tried to call me, of course, dozens of times. Voicemails shifted from rage to pleading, from threats to whimpers. Dad, you can't do this. We're family. You owe me. Please, I need you. Each message was a reminder of the life I had escaped, the endless cycle of demand and sacrifice. I let them pile up unheard until the inbox was full. For years, I had been the one begging for respect, for gratitude, for a sliver of recognition. Now the roles were reversed. Ethan begged, and I remained silent, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Some debts can't be repaid with words. Some wounds heal only when the begging stops. My wife asked me once, "Do you regret it? Cutting him out?" I looked at her across the table, at the woman who had stayed silent too long, and shook my head. "No," I said. "I regret waiting this long." I did not celebrate. I did not toast my victory. I simply began to breathe differently, slower, steadier. I walked through the garden without feeling the weight of invisible chains. I slept without calculating Ethan's bills in my head. My shoulders, bent for decades under the load of sacrifice, finally began to straighten. Ethan's life unraveled in the distance. His wife's family abandoned him. His colleagues no longer trusted him, and even his friends grew scarce. But that collapse belonged to him, not me. For once, I carried nothing of his. The burden was his alone. The aftermath of revenge was not fire or fury. It was quiet. And in that quiet, I finally heard something I had long forgotten, my own heartbeat, steady and free. After the dust settled, I made a decision that surprised even me. I left the house Ethan had once called his inheritance. Too many of its walls carried echoes of his voice. Too many corners reminded me of arguments, sacrifices, and silence. I wanted something smaller, something mine. I found a modest cottage on the edge of town, with peeling white paint and a garden that had been left untended for years. To anyone else, it looked tired. To me, it looked free. I bought it with money Ethan would never touch, and for the first time in my life, I signed a deed, not for someone else's future, but for my own peace. The first weeks were strange. I woke each morning expecting a phone call, a request, a crisis. But the phone stayed quiet. I brewed coffee, walked out onto the porch, and listened to the world move without me rushing to save anyone. I planted tomatoes in the backyard, my hands in the dirt instead of buried in paperwork. I built a bench under the oak tree, where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sun fall without calculating debts in my head. Neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. They knew me not as Ethan's father, not as the old banker, but simply as Mauricio. I was no longer defined by what I gave or what I endured. I was a man again, not a mule carrying the weight of another's ambition. One afternoon, as I painted the front steps, a thought struck me. I had never owned something untouched by Ethan. Every car, every home, every account had been tied to him somehow. But this cottage was clean, free of his shadow. Each nail I hammered, each seed I planted was a declaration. This is mine. In the quiet of that house, I finally felt what decades of sacrifice had stolen from me. Not wealth, not recognition, freedom. And freedom, I realized, was the only inheritance worth leaving for myself. In the weeks after I moved, word spread through the community. Old friends, neighbors, even retired co-workers began to appear at my door with cautious smiles. At first, I thought they had come out of pity, but I quickly realized it was something else. They came out of respect. For years, they had watched me bend under Ethan's weight. They had seen the long hours, the weary eyes, the way I disappeared from gatherings, because I was always helping my son. They pitied me then, though no one said it aloud. I was the man who gave too much, the father who never stopped paying. But now they spoke differently. You finally stood up for yourself, one neighbor told me, her voice proud. It takes strength to break chains that deep. A former coworker shook my hand firmly and said, I wish I'd had the courage to do what you did. Most of us just suffer in silence. Thanks for watching. Even at the market, strangers nodded at me with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if they knew my story without hearing every detail. My name, once muttered with pity, was spoken with a respect I had never earned in life, only in survival. I didn't seek praise. I wasn't hungry for approval, but their recognition felt like balm on an old wound. For decades, I had been invisible, a man who erased himself to keep another man shining. Now, people saw me not as Ethan's father, but as Mauricio, a man who endured and, at last, refused to be erased. In small gatherings, I began to share pieces of my story, not with bitterness, but with honesty. Each time, I watched heads nod, eyes glisten, and voices murmur. You were right to do it. Respect is not wealth, but it is weighty. It anchors you in the world. For the first time in decades, I walked through town with my head high. Not because of revenge, not because of victory, but because I was no longer carrying shame that didn't belong to me. My wife came to the cottage weeks after I moved in. She stood at the doorway, small against the frame, carrying a paper bag of groceries as if she didn't know how else to arrive. I let her in. The silence between us was not hostile, but fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong word. We sat at the kitchen table. She placed the groceries down, folded her hands, and stared at them as though they might speak for her. Finally, she whispered, I should have defended you. Is not never both? Salvet. The words caught me off guard. For 40 years, she had been my companion in name, but not in battle. Her silence had been a second betrayal, one that carved me slowly, deeper than Ethan's cruelty. And now, here she was, breaking it at last. I watched him take and take, she continued, her voice shaking. I watched you work yourself sick. I watched you pawn your ring, Mauricio, and I stayed quiet because I thought it was peace. But it wasn't peace. It was cowardice. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. I let you stand alone, and I will carry that guilt until I die. I listened, my hands folded, my breath steady. I did not tell her it was fine. It wasn't. I did not absolve her, because forgiveness was no longer in me. But I did not cast her out, either. Her confession was not for me, it was for herself, a release of the silence she had carried like a stone. We sat for a long time in the quiet, the kind that no longer suffocated but settled like dust after a storm. She reached across the table, her fingers trembling, and I let her hand rest on mine. It was not reconciliation, it was not love reborn, but it was truth spoken at last, and that, I decided, was enough. When she left that evening, the cottage did not feel empty. It felt honest, and honesty, however late, was more than silence. In the quiet of the cottage, I found myself reflecting on the long years of sacrifice. I had convinced myself that giving was the purest expression of love. That to deny Ethan nothing was to prove myself a worthy father. But as I sat by the garden, watching the tomatoes sprout under my care, I realized I had misunderstood love entirely. Giving without limit does not build gratitude, it breeds entitlement. I had not raised a son, I had raised a man who believed the world owed him everything, because I had shown him a world where his father never said no. I thought of the nights I worked overtime, the coins I sold, the ring I pawned. Each act felt noble then, but now I saw them as bricks in a prison I built with my own hands. I was both the jailer and the captive, Ethan only rattled the bars I had forged. The lesson came too late to save him, but not too late to save me. For the first time, I was giving with purpose. When I watered the garden, I gave to myself. When I shared vegetables with neighbors, I gave freely, without expectation. These small acts, humble and ordinary, carried more peace than all the checks I had ever written. One evening, I wrote in my journal, I gave, and still, they wanted more. But now, I give to no one who demands, only to those who receive with grace. The page filled with my shaky handwriting, but it felt steady in my heart. The man who had once been consumed by sacrifice was gone. In his place was someone who understood that love is not measured by how much you lose, but by how much you preserve. Ethan may never learn that truth. My wife may live with regret, but I, at last, had learned the lesson that eluded me for 72 years. And in that knowledge, I found something sweeter than forgiveness, freedom from the need to give beyond myself. Ethan's downfall reached me not through his words he had stopped calling, but through whispers that drifted back from the city. His marriage cracked first. His wife, once so proud to show him off, grew weary of the arguments, the unpaid bills, the shame that clung to him like smoke. One day, she left, retreating to her parents' estate, and she did not return. His job followed. Without allies, without the glow of borrowed prestige, he was exposed. Colleagues who once covered for him now stepped aside, letting his failures stand naked. Projects slipped, deadlines collapsed, and eventually, so did his career. The man who had walked into rooms with a polished smile now slumped in the shadows, forgotten. Even his friends, the ones who had laughed at his jokes, who had believed his stories of wealth, turned away. Debt collectors called again, but this time no one answered. He had burned every bridge, and the ashes scattered in the wind. Neighbors spoke of seeing him alone, walking streets with the same arrogance, but thinner now, cracked by desperation. The suits that once gleamed hung loose on his frame. The man who had declared in front of 100 guests that he wished I wasn't his father now had no one to call him son, no one to call him friend, no one to call him husband. And me, I did nothing. I did not call, did not write, did not step in to rescue him as I once had 100 times before. His collapse belonged to him, and I would not steal it away. To intervene would have been to erase the justice I had carved from years of silence. Sometimes, late at night, I pictured him staring at the old will in disbelief, clinging to a future that no longer existed. But that image no longer filled me with sorrow or rage. It filled me with clarity. For the first time, Ethan was carrying the weight of his own life. And for the first time, I was not carrying it with him. The last time I visited Callahan's office, it wasn't with trembling hands or a bowed head. It was with the calm of a man who had already made peace with his decisions. The final documents lay before me, sealed and witnessed. Every asset, every account, every brick of the life I had built was secured. Ethan's name existed nowhere in the paperwork. His shadow, once draped across every corner of my future, was gone. Callahan closed the folder with a decisive snap. "It's finished," he said. Those words, simple and final, felt like the tolling of a bell. Not for me, but for the man my son had chosen to become. I walked out into the sunlight, the city alive around me. For decades, I had walked these streets bent under invisible chains, always hurrying, always calculating what more I could give to keep Ethan afloat. Now, I walked slowly, freely. Each step was mine alone. At home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window. The garden outside swayed in the evening breeze, the tomatoes ripening under my care. Life was quiet, unadorned, but honest. And in that honesty, I found peace. People ask if I ever forgave him. The answer is no. Forgiveness is a gift, and gifts are for the grateful. Ethan was never grateful. He took and took, until there was nothing left but the ruins of my dignity. What I gave him in the end was not forgiveness, but consequence. I do not hate him. Hatred is another chain, and I have carried enough. What I feel is colder, cleaner, indifference. His life is his own now, just as mine is finally mine. I raised my glass to the silence and whispered, "This is not revenge, this is release. No forgiveness, no looking back. Only freedom, the inheritance I finally claimed for myself."